Hello, this is the video for Module 4 where we'll be discussing Imperial Rome. Now there's much more to Roman history than just the empire. In fact, there's many kings, there is a very long republic, but we're going to focus today, just for time's sake, on the empire. So we'll be beginning with the Emperor Augustus. Just a couple of things we're going to be talking about today is this political system of an empire. An empire always fluctuates over time, and that is also true for the Romans. Something else we'll be talking a lot about today is art as a form of propaganda. And by art, I also mean architecture. But these major projects of the emperors were ways to communicate certain ideas of power to the citizens of Rome and to any visitors to Rome as well. You'll also notice that there's a significant adaptation of Greek art and architecture, that the Romans were very interested in what the Greeks did. They liked to collect Greek art, they borrowed Greek prototypes. And also there are a couple of major architectural innovations. A lot of people like to say that the Romans just stole from the Greeks, but it isn't really true. They have a couple of major architectural inventions that really makes them stand out and really shows how important the Romans are for the history of art. So I want to show you this map like I always do. Here we're looking at the same one we typically look at. It's of Europe, Northern Africa, and part of the Middle East. We're focusing exclusively on monuments that were created and displayed in Rome itself or in its immediate environs. So you'll notice in this detail map, for example, the city of Prima Porta, one of the objects we'll be looking at today, was located just north of Rome, although now you have to see it in a museum in Rome. So even though the Roman Empire was quite expansive and occupied the majority of Western Europe for a very long time, we're just going to be looking at things in Rome itself. Okay, so here we have an image of Augustus. I'll talk more about the image in a moment, but let me give you some background on him, this first emperor. His name was actually Octavian, and he was the great nephew of Julius Caesar. Caesar was proclaimed dictator for life, which basically brought the republic to an end. And after Caesar was assassinated by those who did not want him to be a dictator anymore, Augustus avenged his death, seeking out his murderers, and then finally overcoming Mark Antony, who tried to claim himself as the heir apparent to Julius Caesar. So Octavian defeats Mark Antony and adapts this title Augustus, which means exalted or sacred. And he gets that title actually in 27 BCE, so even after he's been emperor for a little bit of time. He was also appointed what's called Pontifex Maximus in the year 12 CE. So with Rome, we're now crossing that bridge between BCE, before the Common Era, and CE, which means the Common Era. This also corresponds to the older version BC and AD. However, it's more politically correct. It has fewer associations with religion if we call it BCE and CE. So that's why I'm saying it like that. Augustus led the empire for nearly 60 years. He established an efficient rule, and it was this great time of stability where Rome had been at civil war for a very long time, even before Caesar took power. So he created this internal peace and economic prosperity that came to be known as the Pax Romana. And this Pax Romana, where there was no war in Rome itself, lasted over 200 years. Maintaining a vast empire took serious leadership and tactics, careful planning, and administrative skill. The government established massive building programs to make the city attractive and to offer services to its citizens. So there's a few different kinds of architecture we'll be talking about today. Some of that is for government and religion. So for example, a forum and a basilica have more to do with government, although in the forum you'll also have temples, which is for religion. For recreation, you have such things as theaters, racetracks, and the public baths. They also developed an extensive road system and built lots of bridges. Many modern roads and highways in Europe actually follow these original Roman roads. Roman bridges are still in use, and the aqueducts, which is something that Rome is very famous for, this ability to bring water to city centers from natural sources. The aqueducts only need minor repairs to be functioning, and actually Rome today still uses its aqueducts. Art under Augustus developed into a new style. There's this idealism grounded in the everyday world. He's known for his art being imperial propaganda, even if it's not always really explicit. So let's start talking about this image. This is called the Augustus of Prima Porta, and it's probably from the early 1st century CE. So very early on. He dies in 14 CE, so it's probably from about the time of his death. It's made of marble and it was originally painted. Just like with Greek architecture and sculpture, Roman architecture and sculpture was also painted. Here we see a combination of Greek idealism and Roman individuality, and this was this new Augustan ideal. So we have this idealized youthful figure in a contrapposto pose, which we saw with the Greeks, but it's very much a portrait of the emperor. And also, it's got a lot of imagery on it that make it very distinctly Roman rather than Greek. This was found at the villa of Livia, who was his wife. So this was displayed at his wife's country estate, essentially. What we see here is a combination of Greek idealism and Roman individuality, which became a new Augustan ideal. So we see this idealized type, we see the contrapposto pose that we saw from the Greeks, but it's very much Roman in the portraiture aspect of it, and also in the imagery that is displayed here, which is very much Roman. The Roman ideal is grounded in the appearance of the everyday world. And as I mentioned before, we can think of this as propaganda. Augustus is shown raising his arm in the gesture of an orator, who is somebody who would address the people. And it's also combined with the pose and these ideal proportions that we saw in something like the Doryphorus. There's also mythological imagery, which exalts Augustus's position. For example, in this detail view, we see the little baby who's riding the dolphin, who is down at the leg of Augustus. But what that is it's actually representing Cupid. Cupid was the son of the goddess Venus, and this dolphin is also a symbol of Venus, who is said to have been born out of the sea. And the reason for this is that the Julio-Claudian family, the family of Augustus, claimed themselves to be descendants of the goddess Venus. Just to show you a couple more details here, I wanted to compare this portrait of Augustus with the Augustus of Prima Porta, so this is a detail of that on the right side, with something that comes from the Roman Republic. This is called a veristic portrait. It's very typical of the Romans. The Romans prize individuality, and these veristic portraits that survive, lots and lots of them survive actually, show these deep set wrinkles, probably exaggerating what the face of the man actually looked like in order to show him as an individual, to show his wisdom, and they prized this idea of individuality and wisdom. And here we have, for comparison, just so you can see the adaptation of the Doryphorus on the left side, which we studied with the early classical period in ancient Greece, and then on the right we have the Augustus of Prima Porta. So you see that same stride forward, you see the similar positioning of the strut, the similar shift in the hips, but here instead of bearing a spear, although the Augustus is holding a staff, we have him in an orator's position. We have him clothed as a general, even though Augustus himself was not really a very good general. So it's a very Roman version of the spear bearer. Here's an image to give you a sense of what it probably originally looked like. So it would have seemed much more lifelike, and the detail that's visible on the armor that he's wearing would have been even more visible to the original viewer. Also, his eyes are painted, his lips are painted, and even the hair on both him and the Cupid figure are painted. I want to talk a little bit more about what's going on his armor. What he's wearing there is called a cuirass. It's a breastplate as part of this armor. And there's some very specific images being shown here. He's projecting this image of a benign ruler, emphasizing this time of peace and emphasizing his connection to the gods. He's somebody who governs by reason and persuasion rather than autocratic power, and that's what this imagery is projecting that we see on the cuirass. What we're seeing in the very center here is the return of the standards from a group called the Parthians. So well over a century before, a careless Roman general had gone into a battle and lost, and the defeat was so bad that he actually lost the standard. And that is, think of it sort of like a flag that we use today. It's this symbol of the troops, and that's what the figure on the right is holding. He's holding this long staff with the discs topped by the imperial eagle. Notice his clothing is quite different than the figure on the left side. The figure on the left is a Roman wearing very similar garb to what Augustus is having. And what happened is under Augustus, the Parthians returned the standard, this major symbol, and they did it through diplomatic negotiation. There was no war involved at all. So in this portrait, Augustus is shown quite young in the face, even though he was pretty old or maybe even dead when this was made. His portrait types are very standardized. This is very common with the Roman emperors, so that there is one single image of the emperor no matter what the media is, no matter where it's being produced. And so it's very easy to identify these Roman emperors. He's always shown as this vigorous young ruler, even though he was not really that powerful as a general himself. The fact that he's shown barefoot also may indicate the fact that he was deified after his death. This actually happened with a number of Roman emperors, that upon their death, they became gods. Now I'd like to move on to this monument, which comes about 60 years after the death of Augustus. This is the Colosseum, often also called the Flavian Amphitheater. It gets the name Flavian Amphitheater because that was the name of the dynasty of the emperors who built it. So now we're moving out of the Julio-Claudian dynasty of Augustus and his descendants, and now we're moving to what's called the Flavians. Now, with Greece, we looked at the Theater of Epidaurus, and you might have noticed that it was a half theater, so there was a semicircle of seats. In Rome, they adapt that idea of the Greek theater, but they put two of them together, creating what's called an amphitheater. So basically two Greek theaters put together. Construction began on this monument under the Emperor Vespasian in the year 72 CE, and it was completed under the Emperor Titus and dedicated in 80 CE. It's called the Colosseum because there used to be a colossal statue nearby, so it's an adaptation of that word colossus. And it's actually a very interesting story why it was built. The very last emperor of the Julio-Claudians was Nero, and Nero is very famous for being this crazy emperor, the one who supposedly fiddled while Rome burned. Well, Nero likely ordered that fire to be set himself because in the central area of Rome, you have to imagine the Colosseum not here. The Forum is directly behind this, so this very central area, he built an enormous house, the Golden House of Nero. And right on the side of the Colosseum was this artificial lake, which was the centerpiece of the Golden House. After Nero was overthrown, the Flavians decided to, as a way to apologize to the Roman people for how crazy Nero was, they built them this enormous amphitheater, this entertainment center for athletic events and spectacles that included animal hunts, fights to the death between gladiators or gladiators and animals, performances, and mock sea battles. These games were mostly for entertainment, but also sometimes they would hold funerary games here. And this can also be seen as propaganda because the emperor would announce games as a gift to the public. Here's another view of it. You can see that we're missing about half of the exterior circle. It didn't always look like this. Restored, it was completely symmetrical on either side. Here's a reconstruction and a cutaway drawing to give you a sense of what it may have looked like. It's sort of combining it with what we have left today. It's a very efficient seating plan, and it could have held more than 50,000 spectators at a time. It's constructed out of a series of barrel vaults, which is an architectural type developed by the Romans. The Romans, one of their two major architectural innovations was the development of the arch. So you see all of the arches all around the exterior and interior rows. Well, a barrel vault is the extension of an arch through space. So a barrel vault is a simple arched vaulting system. When two barrel vaults intersect, they call it a groin vault, so it often has a sort of X shape over your head. You notice also in this image an awning that could have been retracted or pulled out on sunny days to shade the people, because often people would spend an entire day here. Now I mentioned that this is a very efficient seating plan, and what I mean by that is that even though it could hold 50,000 people, it's said that it was able to be filled or emptied in less than 20 minutes. It's very, very efficient. You have many exits, lots of stairwells, and in fact, it's such an efficient seating system that we even base our stadiums today on it. So you can maybe see from this football stadium just how valuable this innovation of the... Here's another cutaway view of a reconstruction. So you can see also here these three distinctive levels of archways over on the right side. You can also see the sort of underbelly of the stage area, and that's mostly what survives today are these foundations that once supported a stage. So you can imagine that when games were taking place, they could throw a stage over it, and then they would often cover it in sand so that any sort of event could take place there. Sometimes they were also thought to have flooded it to perform mock sea battles, although that's somewhat debated. This image also gives you an indication of just how decorated the space was. In the upper row, you can see statues all around, and originally the exterior would have had statues in each of these archways except for the bottom level as well. Time has taken these away, as has the fact that the Colosseum was used as a find site for stones, for sculptures in the later periods of Rome. So in this outer wall, we can see the three levels of arcades, and an arcade is a series of arches. These are framed by engaged columns between each arch. You see those sort of half columns. Engaged columns mean they're attached to the wall. And each level uses a different architectural order. Now, the Romans adapt the same architectural orders as the Greeks. So on the bottom, we see the most simple Doric. The next level, we see the more complicated Ionic. On the third level, we see the Corinthian type. And on the very top level, we have a different thing going on here. Instead of an engaged column, you have a flat column. These are called pilasters. And it's topped with a capital that looks quite similar to a Corinthian, but this is actually a Roman development, and it's called a composite capital. It tends to have larger volutes like the Ionic with the acanthus leaves of the Corinthian. The other major architectural innovation of the Romans was the invention of concrete. And this is why they're able to use arches so well, and with other monuments, they created domes out of this concrete. So the majority of the Colosseum was made with concrete, and then it was faced with decorative materials. You see all the gouge marks on the exterior because that was where they attached the marble facing to it. The richest materials from the Colosseum have all been removed. This is a very good example of the evidence of the prosperity of the empire. They spent a lot of money for an entertainment venue. And there's actually Roman amphitheaters that survive in many, many different cities. And unlike the Greeks, they don't need to build it in a hillside. They just decide to spend more money on architectural materials, building up the height of the theater themselves. And here finally is just an image of the groin vaults. You can see these extensions of arches through space going forward, and then each intersecting archway through the different levels has another barrel vault. So when those intersect, you have this sort of X shape that appears. You can see it all the way down through this vaulting system. This is an even better explanation of these vaulting systems. So on the lower left, we have a barrel vault, which imagine it building one single archway out of these individual stones and just connecting it to more arches. And here's an even better view of the groin vault and what survives in the Colosseum. This is a perfect drawing of it. Here I'm showing you a model of ancient Rome, just to give you a sense of where these things are located in the city. So here we have the Colosseum. Here is the Roman Forum, which today is an archaeological site. It looks quite different than this today. The Capitoline Hill is up here, where the two major temples to Juno and Jupiter, which corresponds to the Greek gods Hera and Zeus. Here we have the Palatine Hill, which was the residence of the emperors. Here you see some of the aqueducts coming into the city. Here's what's called the Circus Maximus. It was the largest racetrack in the city where chariot races would take place. All along what's called the spina, this spine, they would have obelisks and sculptures. And here is where the emperor could actually watch from his own palace. Here's a view of the Roman Forum today. You can see how much has been lost over time. Things get lost as people reuse materials for other building projects or earthquakes happen. So there's a lot of reasons why ancient Rome is virtually gone, although it does survive pretty well intact. They're always finding new things underground in Rome. The Forum was the center of public life. It was built up quite slowly over time by different emperors, with temples and markets, the Senate House, the platform for orators to come and make announcements to the people. It's really a hodgepodge of construction. The Forum was also where triumphal processions would take place, so anytime an emperor was victorious in battle elsewhere, They would process all of the goods that they acquired, the spolia, the booty, the spoils of war, through the city center. And most often these triumphal processions would go through these archways, which are called triumphal arches. The one we're seeing here is the Arch of Titus in Rome, and it dates to about 81 CE. And this is built out of concrete. It's got a concrete core and then is faced with white marble. It's about 50 feet high. Now, I say that it dates from about 81 CE, but the thing is this is actually mostly a 19th century reconstruction. This is something that a lot of people don't realize when they come visit the Forum. This central archway is still almost completely intact from the Roman period, as is this sculpture. But the rest of this is actually a 19th century body, because eventually this arch gets built into, or a medieval castle gets built around it, and it served as the entryway to this medieval castle. So this is always a thing to think about when you're looking at archaeological materials, is how much has been rebuilt. So this type of arch, as I said, is called a triumphal arch, although they didn't always commemorate a military victory. This one did. They were also used to commemorate a range of historical events, sometimes even the completion of major public works projects. These are propaganda monuments, though. This one was commissioned to memorialize the Emperor Titus, who had died after only 2 years as emperor, and it was built by his brother who succeeded him. Originally, it probably would have been crowned with gilt bronze statues, so that's bronze statues covered in gold. Some of the architectural elements we can see here are the single vaulted passageway, so only one opening. If you look through the arch to the other side of the Forum, you can see another triumphal arch. That one has 3 arched passageways. You can also see engaged columns, which we talked about with the Colosseum, so not completely in the round, freestanding columns. We also have capitals of that composite type that I mentioned that the Romans developed. Here in the triangles formed by the arch right here, and here we have victory figures. So remember with Athena Nike, the victory version of Athena, we have the same sort of figures. So we're commemorating a victory here. The inscription in the Attic story says that it's dedicated to Titus, who was son of the god Vespasian. So remember I said that after emperors died, they're often deified, and Vespasian is a very good example of that. Today, this monument ceremonially marks the entrance to the Forum. And this was the pathway of the triumphs that emperors would hold. So they would go through this arch, through the Forum, end through the arch that we can see through the passageway, and then climb up the Capitoline Hill where the major ceremonies would take place. And there's a couple of elements of sculpture that I want to point out to you. Here's the first one. This is found on one side of that single vaulted passageway. Let me go back for just a second and I'll show you where. Wrong direction. Here's the second one. So these sculptures are found here and on the opposite side. This view doesn't show it. So I'm going to start with this one. This is a scene called the Spoils of Jerusalem. And this is actually telling us what victory this is commemorating. What this shows is this parade down the Via Sacra, the sacred way where these processions would take place. And this is showing the army and the people carrying all of the spoils after Titus's army had conquered Judea in 81 CE. The spoils from this war included the menorah from the temple in Jerusalem, which is the most prominent image displayed here. So the treasure from the temple in Jerusalem was brought to Rome by Titus. There's a great sense of motion going on here. You can really get a sense that these figures are moving forward through this space. It's a very deep level of relief, so we would call this high relief. But you might notice that some figures, especially those in the background, are shown in lower relief to give a sense that they're further back in space. So the closer they are to us, the more fully carved they are. And you might notice that they're moving this way. They're moving in this direction with the menorah, with these other spoils, with trumpets. They're proclaiming their victory. And notice where they're heading. They're actually walking through a triumphal arch right here. It projects just a little bit out. You can see the horses that would have been placed on top. Maybe it's supposed to be the Arch of Titus itself. It's kind of an interesting little image within an image. Opposite the Spoils of Jerusalem image, we have a scene of the emperor himself. Now, we've lost his face, unfortunately, but here we see the Emperor Titus standing in a chariot drawn by 4 horses, surrounded by other soldiers and other people who are parading in this triumph. It's a very dramatic representation. You can see the horses are all marching in time with each other. You can see all of these spears and lances that are being raised in the air. Standing behind Titus is another victory figure, just like on the front of the arch. You can see her wings. And originally she would have been holding a crown to be crowning the Emperor Titus, showing his victory even more explicitly. So it shows of the Roman interest in telling the story of an actual event. But to a certain extent, you have to remember that this is propaganda. So they're trying to convey a very particular idea of this historical event. Here's a schematic diagram showing the plan of various areas of the city. So we have the Colosseum right here indicated as number 22. The Palatine is just off of this area. Here we have the body of the Roman Forum. This was the Republican Forum, one of the oldest parts of the city. And eventually different emperors, they would add monuments to the Roman Forum, the Republican Forum, but they would also often build forums themselves. So that's what we're seeing in this diagram behind here. So it was built on a different axis, and here we're actually seeing the forums of several different emperors. Here we have the Forum of Caesar, the Forum of Augustus, the Forum of Nerva. This is called the Forum of Peace. And then finally, what we're going to focus on now is called the Forum of Trajan. And that's this entire section here. It's this massive complex that was built in about 110 to 113 CE. This was the last and largest of the imperial fora. That's the plural word for forum. And it was actually finished under the next emperor named Hadrian, so done in about 117 CE. It was, like I mentioned, it was built next to the earlier forums of Augustus and Caesar, and so there was this straight central axis leading from the Forum of Augustus into the Forum of Trajan. And this is not an accident. Trajan wanted to be associated with Augustus, which is why he built his forum on this site. So he's linking himself visually, mimicking his forum plan and the decorative design, and he's linking himself spatially by putting himself in line with these two great rulers, so Augustus here and Caesar here. The basic plan we see is this very large open courtyard. In the center was an equestrian statue of Trajan. We'll talk about equestrian statues in just a minute. There was a monumental entrance. You can sort of see the indication here to this area called the Basilica. And I'll show you some more images of the Basilica in just a minute, but this is a very important word for you to know. It also had an entire market complex, which actually survives very well intact. If you have a chance to come to Rome, it's a really fascinating museum. And then behind the basilica, you have a few other major monuments. You have two small libraries. In the center between the libraries, you had a monumental column, which also served as the funerary monument of Trajan. His ashes were interred there. And then behind the column, at the far end of the forum, was the temple to the divine Trajan. So it's a significant monumental complex. Here's an even more specific plan showing you all of these things that I just mentioned. This way you can see it a little bit better in relationship just to itself rather than in relation to all of the other imperial fora. Here's a reconstruction drawing so you can get a sense of just how monumental some of these features were. So here you have the entrance into the forum, through the Forum of Augustus, the equestrian statue, part of the markets over here. This isn't really showing all of the markets. Here's the basilica, which we'll talk about in some depth. Here's the monumental entrance to the basilica. The two libraries are indicated as number 3, the column of Trajan here, and then the temple of the divine Trajan. This is a hypothetical reconstruction of what that monumental entrance would have looked like. So archaeologists can base reconstructions on the foundations that survive from descriptions and from other materials that they find during excavations. Although you can imagine that most of this is lost over time. We don't have nearly this much sculpture that survives. These were lavish spaces. So here I'm showing you the colonnade around that central courtyard. These would have been covered in colored marble, which you're seeing on the floor. The walls would have been covered in this beautiful colored marble. The ceiling, this long barrel vault, would have been painted and decorated in stucco. So they were lavish public spaces. All of Rome was colorful and covered in marble. Here now, let's move to what's called the Basilica, and this one has a very specific name. It's called the Basilica Oppia. This was at the very end of that forum, and its major function was as a law court. So when I say basilica, you may actually think of the modern definition of that, which we often think of as a Catholic church. I'll explain later how this changes. But in ancient Rome, a basilica is a secular public space. This one was a law court. Many of them were law courts. Others served as imperial audience chambers. They might be army drill halls or even schools. This central open area is referred to as the nave, and it was lit by these open galleries here, or perhaps, we don't really know for sure, this may have been solid wall with windows in this level. And you can see this flat coffered ceiling. These little areas are called coffers, these recesses. At either end of the basilica would have been what's called an apse, and those are semicircular ends. You can kind of get a sense of it in this reconstruction. And that is where the judge would have sat during the law court. It's the focal point of the space. Now I just wanted to show you an image of the Column of Trajan. This is perhaps the most famous monument from his forum, and it survives extremely well. You can see around it in this image on the left these columns that archaeologists have reconstructed that would have formed part of the basilica and part of the library. See all that brick that they've added? That's how you can tell that they're reconstructions. So the Column of Trajan was this massive public monument that actually tells a story from bottom to top. So you can see these different registers. Actually, this is a continuous spiral of imagery, and it actually gets larger as it goes to the top, so it's more easily readable from below. It's like a scroll has been wrapped around the monument, and it's a sort of gesture to the libraries that would have been on either side of it. So that's what would have been kept in the libraries, are these scrolls. It's all about monumentality and propaganda, just like a triumphal arch. It's monumental storytelling. It's done in very low relief, which you can see the image here on the right side. I'm showing you an image from very low down on the column. This comes from a very long tradition of using relief sculpture to tell a story, but it is a particularly Roman method of storytelling, so relief sculpture as a way to tell a narrative. The column is just under 98 feet tall, and including the base, it's 128 feet high. The base itself, it's hard to see in this image, I apologize, but it's showing different elements of battle, armor that they would have removed from their enemies. And at the base of the column here, you've got a wreath, which is a symbol of victory. The narrative that's being depicted in this relief sculpture is about Trajan's wars against Germanic tribes. So he did a lot to expand the empire, especially into what is modern-day Germany. And the bands here that seem to separate the registers, they're always acting as ground lines. So what I'm showing you at the very bottom here is the imperial army's departure for Germany. So here you see the city of Rome in the background. Here you see a river god. See the water below him and all of these boats. So the imperial army is leaving the city and getting ready to go fight this war. And you can see different elements on here of preparations for battle. Trajan is shown several times himself, and he's always shown, remember that's an example of hieratic scale, which we talked about with the Egyptians. In some scenes we see the barbarians, the Germanic tribes, and sometimes they're shown as very heroic in their deaths, but other times they're shown begging. So they have a very interesting relationship with how they depict their enemies. So it's a fascinating monument that survives extremely well. There are actually two standing columns like this in Rome today. The next one comes a bit later. There used to be three, but one has been lost. All we have surviving of it is its base, and it's fascinating to think how an enormous column like this can just disappear over time. Now I'd like to move on to this monument, one of the most famous surviving temples from ancient Rome. This is called the Pantheon, and I want you to keep that very straight in your head from the Parthenon, which is in Greek. Parthenon referring to Athena Parthenos. Here the Pantheon is referring to its dedication. The word Pantheon means all the gods, and so it was dedicated to every single god. What we have here is what looks like a normal Roman temple front. We see the porch of it here, but then you've got something very different. You have this enormous rotunda, this huge circular space behind it covered by a shallow dome that has an oculus opening up to the sky. So as I mentioned, the Romans adapt a lot of Greek types. For example, I'm showing you the Parthenon again here, and you can see the porch element is absolutely derived from this, the idea of the columns with some kind of architrave and entablature over it with decoration, and then the pediment here. Here I'm showing you a monument that's actually in Nîmes, France, and this is from the Roman Republican era. This is just to show you a transitionary monument where we see the adaptation of the Greek type, but this is done in a very Roman way. So this is raised on this interesting platform. Instead of having stairs all around like the Parthenon, you only have stairs leading up to the porch. Instead of having an open colonnade so that you could really approach from any side, the Romans actually built the cella extending to the exterior walls instead of as a central area after a double colonnade. So it's just a different adaptation of that style. So here we have a view of the front of the Pantheon. You can still get a sense of its dome here. So you see that portico, this porch with a colonnade here. Above the colonnade, you see the inscription, which tells us that it was built by Marcus Agrippa, son of Lucius, who was consul 3 times. Now, Agrippa was an advisor of Augustus, and he is the one who built the original temple here. The one we're seeing was built under the Emperor Hadrian. The original was destroyed by fire, so when Hadrian rebuilt it, he left the inscription dedicating it to Agrippa, which is kind of an interesting thing. Structurally, this is a very atypical Roman temple because we have this big round space. Here's a reconstruction of what it actually would have looked like. So there was originally a large forecourt surrounded by colonnades that extended all the way around and up to the porch. Notice also the little people here, how they would have had to climb stairs to get inside. I'm going to go back for a second. If you look here, unfortunately this isn't showing it quite as dramatically as I would like, but this is actually a really significant slope down into the Pantheon. You can see here on either side these walls built up around the sides, and that's because this managed to stay at about its original level, but the ground level of Rome has raised by several meters. It's at least 10 to 15 meters higher, and even more so in some parts of the city. And this is in the floodplain of the Tiber River, so that's one of the major reasons that the ground level has raised so considerably. But originally it would have had a very different effect. Originally you would have been surrounded by these colonnades down below, so you would not have seen the roundness of this temple. You would approach it and go inside thinking you were entering any other Roman temple, that it would have been very much like the temples you were used to seeing, but that is actually not the case. Here's another reconstruction of the area of the city. You can see how built up it was, several other temples in the area. There was even a basilica attached to the back that was almost certainly a law court, but this maybe gives you a better sense of how difficult it would have been to see this. You would have even had a hard time seeing the dome because of this major projection right here. Here's a view of the interior. It's very hard to get photographs of the interior of this space because it's so wide across and the dome is so shallow, it's just almost impossible. So this is a bit of a skewed fisheye version here. You get this very dramatic light coming in from the oculus, and your eye is drawn upwards to this light, and so it's very nice association with all of the gods who even the Romans thought of as in the heavens, in the skies. The interior was covered with colored marbles, much of which still survives. You can see it in the flooring, you can see it in the wall decoration. This is a reconstruction done in the 18th century, so this is not what it originally would have looked like. Now, one of the major reasons it survived so well is because in the 600s it was turned into a Christian church. So now if you go inside it, it's a church. Inside all of these little areas are now altars and Christian statues, but originally there would have been statues to the gods here instead. The dome has a coffering system, but maybe you can tell from this view that they're quite irregular. They're much larger at the bottom than they are at the top, and that's to give the illusion that the dome is actually higher than it is. The cofferings serve a couple of functions to create this illusion, but also it really lightens the weight of the dome. This dome is made out of concrete, and concrete is a fairly lightweight material, but this is a huge amount of concrete, and so the coffering takes out some of the weight so that it can support itself a little bit better. Here's another view showing the dramatic lighting that comes in through the oculus, and it moves through the space throughout the day. Rain comes in, I went once when a huge snowstorm was happening and snow fell in through the oculus. It's pretty incredible. Here's a plan and a cutaway view, a cutaway section of the interior, and that's showing you that inside is a perfect sphere. So all the way around you would be able to fit an enormous sphere that was perfectly even throughout. It's likely that Hadrian also used this space as an audience hall, which would have been incredibly magnificent if you can think about that. The Pantheon is an exploration of the ability of interior spaces. It's marking a shift, and it shows this interest of the Romans in innovation. Politically, it's indicating the relationship between the emperor and his divine status, even while he's alive. So if he's having an audience hall in this temple dedicated to all the gods, there's a specific association that he's looking for there. This exemplifies Roman interest in thinking of architecture in terms of space contained rather than the individual elements. This is something else that differentiates Roman architecture from Greeks, because they're interested in how you experience the interior of the space rather than all of its individual elements. Yes, the individual elements are important, but it's how those elements can shape an experience of the viewer, of the visitor. Here's another cutaway view to give you another sense of that. It shows the colonnade, it shows the columns of the porch, and what the interior would have looked like originally. The coffering would have been painted, and here's what the upper level, this middle level, would have looked like originally. So the core of this is concrete. There's lots of arches being used throughout, especially here. And really a dome is an arch that's been turned around itself 360 degrees. So the Pantheon is this epitome of Roman architectural innovation. And here is just another interior of the space to give you a sense of what it's like to visit. See how hard it is to get a photograph. You can't even see the oculus in this one. But it's just this beautiful, perfect space. It is unlike anything in the world. It's a building I never get tired of going into in Rome, even though I've probably been 25 or 30 times. It's just an amazing experience to have something survive so well intact from the early 100s and to be in this space as shaped by the Romans. So now let's jump forward just a little bit more in time to the year 176 CE. This is an equestrian statue of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, and it is made of bronze. You can see some of the gold still surviving on it as well, so it would have been gilded. And it's about 11.5 feet high. Equestrian statues were very common, and I mentioned one with Trajan's Forum as well. And equestrian refers to the fact that the figure is on horseback. This is one of the most famous ancient Roman sculptures. It was never lost, meaning that it was never buried underground or discovered under rubble. This survived intact and was displayed in Rome for the entirety of its life. It used to be down by the Cathedral of Rome called the Lateran. And then eventually it was moved to the Capitoline Hill in the 1500s. But one of the reasons it survived, you may remember I mentioned that there's not a lot of bronzes that survive from antiquity, and that's because they would often melt them down. Well, most art historians explain this by saying that they actually thought it represented Constantine, and there's sources that tell us about the equestrian statue of Constantine. And we'll talk more about Constantine later, but he was the first Christian emperor, so it wasn't something that the Christians wanted to destroy. What we're seeing here is actually a quotation of the Augustus of Prima Porta. So we have the emperor triumphant on horseback. He's lifting his arm in a gesture of oration. Notice he's not wearing armor or a cuirass like Augustus. Instead, he's wearing a toga, which typically is a sign of a philosopher. Showing himself in this toga and the long beard is really a Greek style. He's shown as a philosopher, but the fact that he's on horseback also makes him fairly triumphant. And it's thought that originally there may have been a barbarian under the hoof of the horse that's raised up. The horse lifts him up off the ground, which lends him quite a bit of stature. This was the first monumental equestrian statue created. It is larger than life size, and one thing I want you to notice is as you look at this, everything looks in proportion, but if you start looking at it long enough, you actually see that the emperor is really large compared to the horse. That's one problem with equestrian statues, is you don't want to show your rider too small, because then they don't seem so important. And so the artist who's created this has managed to find a balance between the sizes of the two figures, while still making the emperor seem very monumental. So it would have been displayed on a high base. He would have been looking down at you. Here's another view of the original in the museum today. This is probably the ideal view where the emperor seems to be looking at you, as does the horse. His gesture might be one of oration, like I mentioned, this quotation of the Augusta Suprema Porta, but we can maybe also see it as a sign of pardon, especially if we're one of his enemies. Perhaps he's pardoning us. And that's part of the whole philosopher concept. Marcus Aurelius actually was one of these good emperors. He wrote quite a bit about philosophy and life and even some battle tactics. But he was one of these good, peaceful emperors of the 2nd century CE. The really famous ones, we've actually talked about all of them. The 3 most well-known emperors of the 2nd century are Trajan, Hadrian, and Marcus Aurelius. They were considered the good emperors, even by later Christians. Here I'm showing you the reproduction that now stands on the Capitoline Hill. The original stayed there for 400 years before it was so damaged by the pollution of Rome that they brought it inside to the museum. That's actually, you can just see the corner of the museum it's in right here. So it's very nearby. It's location since the 1500s, and it's the centerpiece of this square that Michelangelo actually designed. Just for a second, I want to compare the 2 different representation ruling figures. One from ancient Egypt, we have the mask of King Tutankhamun on the left, and on the right we have the portrait from the equestrian sculpture of Marcus Aurelius. You can see these 2 very different methods of representation. Of course, we have some differences in materials. Tutankhamun's is gold with semi-precious stones, whereas Marcus Aurelius was bronze that would have been gilded, so covered in gold as well. So you have this similarity also in these precious materials. But you also have significant differences in representation and function as well. So the function, we have the funerary mask with Tutankhamun buried directly over his body, not meant to be seen by anyone, part of his rights to get into the underworld, to emphasize his divine kingship for all time. Whereas with the statue of Marcus Aurelius, that was intended to be seen by the populace. It's a very good example of Roman propaganda in comparison with the Egyptian emphasis on the afterlife. The Romans were also interested in the afterlife, especially since they deified their emperors, but they were very interested in art to communicate to the people. In this close-up view of the portrait of Marcus Aurelius, we get a much better sense of his hair, the refinement of the curls, of the perfect curling of the beard in this very Greek style. You also don't have an idealized face. I mean, I'm sure this is not exactly what the emperor looked like, but there's individuality. There's these sort of sagging eyelids. He's not perfect and idealized like Tutankhamun was. This is surely not how King Tutankhamun looked. This is an idea of how Marcus Aurelius looked. So we have very different strategies of representation. There's an interest in naturalism with the Romans, just like with the Greeks, but it's an idealized portrait type. So they're more interested in nature, not making things too idealized. I want to end with this monument today, and I'm jumping forward to about the year 300 CE, so I'm skipping about 100 years of Roman history. The 3rd century, that's the 200 CE, was a time of political instability in Rome. There were more battles being fought outside of the city. There still wasn't civil war in the city itself, but there's a very quick succession of emperors. Often generals would take over the army and then proclaim themselves emperor. So there's a bit of instability compared to the very peaceful 1st and 2nd centuries CE. What I'm showing you here is a monument called the Tetrarchs. And this is reflecting a new form of government developed by the Emperor Diocletian called a tetrarchy. And that word means rule of 4. What happened was that Diocletian actually split the empire into east and west, and each half had 2 rulers. One, the Augustus, who was designated as the subordinate and heir to the Caesar. So the Caesar was the head because this word Caesar means emperor. And so the Augustus was sort of the king in training. And ideally what happened with Diocletian, what Diocletian's ideal was that the Caesar would actually step down, would retire instead of dying, so that there would be a more peaceful succession of emperors. It really didn't last very long, unfortunately. So this statue is meant to make a statement about this political system. It shows a turn in art as well towards a sort of abstraction and symbolic representations. The four figures are nearly identical, which is emphasizing their connection, this peaceful rule. They're simplified from natural forms into basic geometric shapes, so it's a bit stylized. And there's a disregard for normal human proportions. See, they're kind of squatty just a little bit. But that's okay. They're sacrificing this naturalism for the sake of the message. Each set embraces each other, showing an imperial unity, and this was a piece of propaganda and a summary of the state of affairs at the time. This is made out of a stone called porphyry, which actually was used exclusively by the emperors. It's this very precious purple stone that only comes from one quarry in Egypt. This is one reason that the color purple is associated with the idea of an emperor or an imperial idea. So with these figures, we have this new emphasis on the message rather than naturalism, this embrace, this clutching of their swords. They're these all-powerful figures. The artists and patrons are choosing to show things differently, the stylization lacking individuality, not because they're not able to do it, but because they're choosing to focus on the message. And this is a good place to stop to set us up for our next module, Module 5, which will be about late antiquity, after the Tetrarchy, where we'll talk about the Emperor Constantine. So a few of the things that I talked about today was this adaptation of Greek models through architecture and specifically through sculpture with that contrapposto pose, a sort of idealization. But remember, with the Romans, there is much more emphasis on portraiture and deriving things from nature, so that it's not quite as much idealization. They're interested in showing individuals. We talked about the rise and actually the beginning of the decline of the empire with the Tetrarchy and with the unstable 3rd century. We also focused quite a bit on the building up of the imperial city. So most of the monuments we looked at were displayed in the city of Rome or still stand in the city of Rome. Remember that art and architecture are powerful symbols of propaganda, from the Tetrarchs here portraying this message of unity in this divided empire, all the way back to the Augustus of Prima Porta, who is showing his association with the gods and is showing himself as this peaceful, benevolent ruler. So now to finish up Module 4, you'll need to take a self-assessment. Remember, that's going to deal with both the material from the lecture, but also from the readings. The next thing to do is a discussion board prompt, which you'll find on Blackboard. Also, this module includes an audio post where you'll choose an object from the collection of the Capitoline Museums and describe it using some of the things you've learned through this module. And finally, the vocabulary wiki. Remember, this is the first time that you all are tackling this. This will be group 1. You can divvy up the work. Think of vocabulary that I've emphasized in this lecture, also from the textbook. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you again for Module 5.